The film was not found in a place meant to preserve memories. It was buried beneath rusted filing cabinets, wrapped in oilcloth darkened by decades of moisture, as if someone had tried to hide it from time itself. When the reel was lifted into the light in the summer of 1954, dust fell from it like ash, and those present later claimed the air in the room felt suddenly colder. The label carried no official seal, only a handwritten name and a year that meant nothing to anyone who saw it. At first, it was assumed to be another forgotten family recording, the kind made by hobbyists experimenting with new cameras, never meant to last beyond a single generation. The opening frames showed an Appalachian hollow cut deep between wooded ridges, the trees standing unnaturally still, as though the wind had been edited out. A farmhouse appeared next, its porch sagging, its windows dark even in daylight. The camera lingered too long on empty doorways, as if waiting for something to step through. When the Reddick family finally came into view, they stood close together, not smiling, not speaking, watching the lens with an attention that felt rehearsed yet uneasy. Their faces bore the strain of people listening for a sound they expected but did not want to hear. As the footage continued, the sense of time began to blur. Days seemed to pass without change in light, and nights arrived without warning. A mother brushed a child's hair beside the same window again and again, yet the child never appeared older, only more aware. In several frames, shapes moved behind the trees, too tall to be shadows, too still to be animals. The camera never turned toward them, but it never moved away either, as though the person filming knew better than to acknowledge what waited beyond the clearing. Near the end of the reel, the family gathered in the living room, seated before something unseen. Their faces reflected a pale flicker, and for a brief, terrible moment, it became clear they were watching the same images now trembling on the screen. The father reached forward, his mouth opening as if to warn whoever might one day find the film, but the frame warped, the image burned white, and the sound collapsed into a low, steady hum. The reel ended there, not with a conclusion, but with the feeling that the story had never truly stopped recording, only learned to wait in the dark. The discovery began as a routine clearing of the old county courthouse, a stone building that had stood for nearly a century at the edge of the Appalachian town, its lower levels long abandoned to leaks, mold, and forgotten paperwork. Workers were ordered to empty the basement before demolition, a place no one had entered willingly for years because the stairs groaned underfoot and the air smelled of wet paper and iron. Filing cabinets lay toppled like gravestones, their drawers spilling records browned by time. In the farthest corner, behind shelves warped by moisture, someone noticed a wooden crate nailed shut and marked with no official stamp, no inventory number, no warning. It did not belong to any known department, and that absence alone made it feel out of place, as though it had been deliberately excluded from memory. When the crate was pried open, the sound echoed strangely through the basement, sharper than expected, causing one of the men to pause with his hand still on the lid. Inside lay a single film reel wrapped in oilcloth, the fabric stiff and darkened as if soaked in something more than water. The reel itself was heavier than it should have been, cold to the touch despite the summer heat outside. There was no accompanying paperwork, no logbook entry, nothing to explain how it came to be stored there. Only a handwritten label, uneven and pressed deep into the paper, bore the words Reddick family followed by the year 1954, written as though the person holding the pen had been in a hurry or afraid of being seen. Those who handled the reel later struggled to explain why the room seemed to change the moment it was exposed to the light. The hum of insects outside faded, replaced by a silence thick enough to notice. Dust hung unmoving in the air, and one worker swore he heard a faint clicking sound, like a projector trying to start with no power. It was decided the reel would be sent upstairs for inspection, yet no one volunteered to carry it alone. As they climbed the stairs, the smell followed, a faint odor of smoke and damp wood that clung to their clothes long after they left the building. What unsettled the officials most was not the condition of the film, but the fact that no one could remember authorizing its storage. The courthouse records from the 1950s were intact, meticulously filed, yet the Reddick name appeared nowhere in property deeds, court cases, or census lists tied to the county. It was as if the film documented something that had never officially existed, preserved not as evidence, but as a reminder someone wanted buried where no one would think to look. When the reel was finally threaded onto a projector, expectations were low, shaped by the assumption that it would contain nothing more than pastoral scenes or a family attempting to preserve ordinary moments. The first images seemed to confirm that belief. A narrow dirt road cut through dense Appalachian forest, the camera shaking slightly as if held by someone unaccustomed to its weight. Sunlight filtered through the trees in thin, pale beams, illuminating patches of ground before vanishing again into shadow. The framing was careful but hesitant, lingering on empty stretches of land longer than necessary, as though the person filming was reluctant to move forward too quickly. Nothing in those opening seconds suggested anything unusual, and several viewers relaxed, convinced the mystery had already begun to dissolve. As the footage continued, subtle inconsistencies began to surface. The farmhouse appeared next, its structure weathered but intact, and a date scratched into the corner of the frame identified the recording as early spring. Yet the surrounding trees were heavy with leaves, their branches full in a way that suggested late summer. Later scenes contradicted this again, showing frost along the ground while insects could still be heard buzzing faintly in the audio track. These contradictions were small enough to be dismissed individually, but together they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore, as if the film itself could not decide when it was taking place. More troubling were the objects captured in the background. A calendar briefly visible on a kitchen wall showed a year that did not match the label on the reel, and a newspaper held by one of the family members carried a headline referencing an event that would not occur until several years later. When the footage jumped forward to what was assumed to be a different day, the same newspaper appeared again, folded in exactly the same way, its pages unyellowed and unchanged. The people on screen did not comment on these details, nor did they seem aware of them, moving through their routines with an unsettling calm. Even the family's behavior raised questions. They performed ordinary tasks, but their movements felt rehearsed, repeated with slight variations, like actors attempting to recreate a memory rather than live within it. In one sequence, the father stepped onto the porch at dawn, the light identical to a previous shot labeled as evening. The shadows fell in the same direction, the clouds fixed in the same shapes, betraying no passage of time. Those watching the film found themselves leaning closer to the screen, searching for some technical explanation, yet none fully accounted for the growing sense that the footage was stitched together from moments that should not coexist. By the time the reel reached its midpoint, the assumption that it documented a simple family record had completely unraveled. What appeared at first to be an innocent chronicle now felt like a distorted record of time itself, captured without explanation, as if the camera had been allowed to see something the people holding it did not fully understand. Once the inconsistencies in the film became impossible to ignore, attention shifted away from the reel itself and toward the people who might remember the Reddick family. Local historians were consulted first, men and women who had spent their lives cataloging births, deaths, and land ownership in the surrounding Appalachian counties. When shown still frames from the footage, they studied the faces carefully, tracing familiar features in silence. None of them recognized the family, and while that absence of memory was troubling, it was not yet alarming. Families came and went, records were lost, and entire hollows could empty within a generation. What unsettled everyone was not the lack of recognition, but the way the room seemed to tighten when the questions continued. As inquiries spread beyond official channels, older residents were approached, people who had lived their entire lives within sight of the same ridgelines. At first, the responses were polite and distant, the kind offered to strangers asking about events long past. Names were repeated, details requested again, and with each repetition, the mood shifted. Conversations ended abruptly. Doors closed more quickly than they had opened. A few people claimed poor hearing or failing memory, only to speak clearly about other subjects moments later. When the name Reddick was spoken aloud, it often produced a pause, a flicker of recognition that vanished before taking shape. One interview, conducted in a small general store near the edge of town, changed the tone of the investigation entirely. An elderly man stocking shelves froze when he saw a photograph pulled from the film. His hand trembled so violently he dropped the box he was holding, and the sound of it hitting the floor echoed through the quiet room. He refused to touch the image, stepping back as if it carried a physical weight. After a long silence, he said only that some families were not meant to be remembered and that the mountains had ways of keeping what belonged to them. No amount of reassurance persuaded him to say more. Others reacted with a fear that felt older than superstition. One woman crossed herself repeatedly, insisting the land shown in the footage had been empty long before 1954. Another whispered that the Reddicks were out of place, a phrase she could not explain but repeated as though it were a warning passed down rather than a thought of her own. None of the interviewees laughed or dismissed the questions as foolish. Their unease was shared, almost practiced, as if silence itself had been taught. By the end of the week, it was clear the Reddick family had not simply been forgotten. They had been deliberately avoided, their name treated like something that could invite attention if spoken too loudly, suggesting a history buried not by time, but by collective fear. The detail that finally shattered any remaining sense of normalcy was discovered not through interviews or speculation, but through careful, almost obsessive examination of the film itself. Investigators began advancing the reel frame by frame, slowing the images until every movement became deliberate and unnatural. It was during one of these sessions that someone noticed the child standing near the edge of the yard in an early sequence, small and thin, with hair falling unevenly across his forehead. He looked no older than 7, his eyes fixed not on the camera, but on something just beyond it. At first, there was nothing remarkable about him, just another figure caught in a family recording, easily overlooked among the adults. As the film progressed, the same child appeared again and again. He was present during meals, standing silently in the background while the others ate. He lingered near doorways, half hidden by shadow, watching conversations he never joined. The unsettling realization came when these appearances were compared across scenes that were clearly separated by long stretches of time. The adults changed slightly from one sequence to the next, their faces showing new lines, their posture subtly altered, but the child remained exactly the same. His height did not change. His features did not soften or sharpen. Even the tear in his shirt sleeve appeared in the same place, as though the fabric itself refused to age. Dates scratched into the corner of the film reinforced what the eye already suspected. Scenes labeled months apart, even years apart, showed the boy unchanged. In one segment, a woman referred to him as still growing, her voice casual, unconcerned, as if she did not see the contradiction in her words. In another, the father placed a hand on the child's shoulder, his expression strained, almost apologetic, before quickly pulling away. The boy never reacted. He did not flinch or smile. He simply continued to stare, his attention fixed on something the camera never revealed. What disturbed viewers most was the sense that the child was aware of the anomaly. In later footage, his gaze occasionally shifted toward the lens, lingering just long enough to suggest recognition. It felt less like a child being filmed and more like something allowing itself to be observed. There was no joy in his movements, no impatience or restlessness, only a quiet stillness that contrasted sharply with the subtle changes happening around him. When the film was played at normal speed, these moments passed too quickly to register, but slowed down, they became impossible to ignore. The discovery reframed everything that came before it. The inconsistencies in time, the fear in the townspeople, the sense of repetition woven through the footage all seemed to orbit this single, unmoving figure. The child was not merely a part of the record, but its anchor, a constant presence that suggested the film was documenting not a family's life, but a condition they were trapped within. The next revelation emerged from the sound rather than the image, discovered almost by accident when an audio technician attempted to clean the film's damaged track. At first, the soundtrack seemed unremarkable, filled with the expected imperfections of an old home recording, the soft whir of the camera motor, distant birds, the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel. Dialogue was sparse and muffled, words often swallowed by wind or static. It was only when the technician isolated the quieter moments, the spaces between voices, that something else began to surface, something that did not belong to any visible source. Beneath the ambient noise, barely audible at normal speed, there were whispers. They did not align with the movements of any person on screen, nor did they follow the rhythm of conversation. When the film was slowed, the whispers stretched and warped, becoming clearer without ever fully resolving into identifiable speech. They seemed to overlap one another, rising and falling in uneven patterns, as though multiple voices were speaking at once from different distances. None of the mouths on screen moved in sync with the sounds, and no one appeared to react to them, even when the whispers grew louder than the surrounding noise. Further analysis revealed that the whispers were not consistent throughout the reel. They clustered around certain scenes, particularly those involving the child or moments when the camera drifted toward the tree line. In one sequence, as the lens lingered on the dark edge of the forest, the whispers intensified, forming what almost sounded like a warning spoken repeatedly, though the words themselves remained indistinct. In another, during a quiet dinner scene, a low murmur crept in beneath the clinking of cutlery, rising just enough to be noticed before fading away again. The family continued eating, their expressions unchanged, as if the sound existed only for whoever would one day listen closely enough. What made the discovery truly unsettling was the realization that the whispers were not random artifacts or damage. Their cadence suggested intention. When played in reverse, fragments seemed to echo forward-facing phrases, as though the audio had been recorded both ahead of and behind the moment it was meant to occupy. Some listeners claimed to hear their own names faintly spoken during playback, while others reported a pressure in their ears, a sensation similar to standing at a great depth underwater. These reactions varied, yet they shared a common unease, a feeling that the sound was not merely being heard, but was actively listening in return. The whispers transformed the film from a visual anomaly into something far more intrusive. It no longer felt like a passive record uncovered by chance, but like a message that had been waiting patiently for the right conditions to be understood. The silence between words became heavier than the dialogue itself, suggesting that whatever had been captured on that reel had found a way to speak without ever needing to show its face. As the film's anomalies mounted, officials turned to land records and survey maps, hoping to ground the mystery in something verifiable. The location shown in the footage was distinctive enough to identify: a narrow hollow flanked by two ridges, a creek bending sharply near a clearing, and a farmhouse positioned at an unusual angle to the slope. Older maps were pulled from archives, some brittle enough to crack when unfolded, and compared against the images frame by frame. The match was undeniable. The land existed exactly where the film suggested it did, yet the records attached to it told a story that directly contradicted what appeared on screen. According to county documents, the property had been officially uninhabited for decades before 1954. The last recorded occupants had vacated the land in the early 1920s, and subsequent surveys described the area as unsuitable for settlement due to repeated structural failures and unexplained disappearances of livestock. No building permits were issued after that point. No tax payments were recorded. The land was marked with a vague notation that it was to remain undeveloped, a rare designation for an area where even marginal ground was usually claimed and worked. There was no mention of a farmhouse, no acknowledgement that a family had lived there in any capacity during the mid-century period. This contradiction raised immediate questions. If the Reddick house was never approved, never taxed, and never acknowledged, how had it been built, and how had it stood long enough to be filmed? Aerial photographs from the late 1940s and early 1950s were examined next. In several of them, the hollow appeared empty, dense with trees and brush, exactly as the records described. Yet in one image, taken the same year as the film, a faint geometric shape could be seen where the farmhouse should have been. It was barely visible, like a shadow that didn't quite belong to the landscape, present in one photograph and gone in the next. Further investigation revealed that official descriptions of the land used strangely evasive language. Phrases like "no permanent habitation observed" and "structures not suitable for record" appeared repeatedly without explanation. These were not standard terms, and no one could account for why they had been used. Surveyors' notes ended abruptly, some pages missing entirely, others bearing signatures from officials who had retired or died under unusual circumstances. The gaps felt intentional, as if the absence of information was itself part of the record. The implication was deeply unsettling. The film showed a family living in a place that, on paper, did not exist as a home at all. The Reddick house occupied a kind of blind spot, visible to the camera yet erased from official memory. It suggested that the family had not merely been forgotten, but that their presence had occurred outside the boundaries of what the county was willing, or able, to acknowledge, leaving the land itself suspended between recognition and denial. The next layer of the mystery emerged from a set of records that were never meant to be revisited. In a locked storage room behind the county clerk's office, ledgers detailing missing persons from the early 20th century were discovered stacked in unmarked boxes. These books were not part of any public index and appeared to have been separated from standard archives long ago. Their pages were thick, handwritten, and meticulously maintained, listing names, dates, and last known locations. At first glance, they seemed ordinary, another grim testament to the dangers of rural life and isolated terrain. It was only when the locations were examined more closely that a pattern began to form. Several entries referenced disappearances near the same hollow shown in the Reddick film. Farmers, traveling salesmen, surveyors, and even a few children were listed as having last been seen passing through or stopping near that area. What set these entries apart was not the number of disappearances, but how they were marked. Instead of being labeled deceased, unresolved, or presumed lost, each of these names had been crossed out with a single, deliberate line of ink. No explanation accompanied the marks. There were no follow-up notes, no conclusions drawn, just the erasure of the names as if they no longer needed to be accounted for. When the dates were compared, the pattern grew more disturbing. The disappearances spanned decades, occurring both before and after the period when the Reddick family was supposedly filmed. Some entries ended only weeks apart, others separated by years, yet all shared the same final notation. The ink used to cross out the names matched across different ledgers, suggesting the same hand, or at least the same instruction, had been responsible. This was not the work of a single clerk making casual decisions, but an established practice repeated over time. One entry in particular drew attention. A family of 3 had been reported missing after visiting relatives near the hollow in the early 1930s. Their case had initially been investigated, only to be abruptly closed with their names struck through, identical to the others. The description of their last known whereabouts placed them within walking distance of the land later associated with the Reddick film. It raised the unsettling possibility that those who vanished had not simply been lost to the wilderness, but had been absorbed into something that rendered their disappearance administratively irrelevant. The ledgers suggested an unspoken understanding among those tasked with keeping records. Certain disappearances were not to be resolved, mourned, or even remembered in the usual way. By crossing out the names, the system itself seemed to be acknowledging that these individuals no longer fit within the normal framework of life and death. The connection to the Reddick property implied that the land did not just hide people physically, but removed them from recognition, rewriting their absence as something that no longer required explanation. The most unnerving discoveries came when the film was examined frame by frame, using digital enhancement to reveal details invisible at normal speed. At first, the footage appeared straightforward, the Reddick family going about their routines, the forest standing quiet and unremarkable in the background. Yet as each frame was scrutinized, shadowy shapes began to emerge just beyond the tree line, figures that had remained unnoticed when the reel was projected at full speed. They were tall, impossibly still, and indistinct in form, blurred at the edges like they existed in a slightly different dimension from the rest of the world. They never moved toward the house or the camera, but they were always watching, their presence consistent across multiple scenes and days. The shapes were only discernible when the film skipped, flickered, or burned slightly under the projector's light, moments that revealed their outlines with startling clarity. During these brief bursts, it became apparent that they were not animals or human visitors, but something altogether different. Their proportions were wrong, limbs elongated, torsos unnaturally rigid, heads tilting at angles that no normal body could sustain. Yet despite their abnormality, they seemed fully aware of the family's activities, observing from the edge of the forest with a patience that made every subsequent frame tense and uneasy. They appeared indifferent to the camera itself, as if it were merely another silent witness to the scene unfolding in their domain. Further analysis revealed a disturbing pattern. The figures always appeared in the same spots relative to the house, almost like markers or guardians. They were visible in the corners of open fields, just beyond fences, standing between trees, yet never encroaching into the family's immediate space. Occasionally, when the camera shifted, a shape would seem to dissolve, only to reappear in a slightly different frame, as though it moved only when unobserved directly. The repetition created a feeling of orchestration, as though the figures were not wandering but performing a ritual whose purpose was entirely unknown to anyone watching. The discovery reframed the film entirely. Previously dismissed as a family record with minor temporal inconsistencies, It now felt like evidence of a hidden presence surrounding the Reddicks. The forest was no longer empty, it had a population, one that existed on the periphery of vision, always present but never directly confronted. Every long shot of the trees, every frame where the family's attention drifted elsewhere, now carried a weight of expectation, a creeping dread that something unseen was always watching, recording, and perhaps waiting. The shape's silent observation suggested that the family, the land, and even the camera itself were caught in a web far larger than any single person could comprehend, a network of attention and presence that seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of the hollow and the year 1954. The most disturbing revelation came in the final segments of the reel, a sequence that defied all expectations and left those who viewed it reeling. The family, previously observed performing daily tasks with a quiet tension, was now gathered in the living room, faces pale in the flickering light, seated around a table that appeared ordinary at first glance. Yet the movement of the camera suggested a shift in perspective. It lingered longer than usual on the family's expressions, capturing subtle tremors in their hands, the barely perceptible tightening of their lips, and eyes that seemed to focus not on the space around them but on something reflected elsewhere, something the viewers could not see. It was only upon careful frame-by-frame examination that the true horror became apparent. In several shots, the family was watching a screen, an old monitor or possibly a projection, on which the same footage that the investigators had been reviewing appeared to play. They were watching themselves, caught in the same moments that had already been recorded. At first, it seemed a trick of timing, a coincidence of editing, but the repetition was too precise. Gestures, expressions, even the flick of a hand over a child's hair matched identically with earlier frames. The implication was inescapable. The Reddicks were aware of the recording, and yet they could do nothing to alter it. They were trapped within the very medium that documented their existence, participating in their own observation with a mechanical inevitability. As the reel progressed, a sense of repetition became more pronounced. The camera lingered on the father's face, his eyes widening as though he recognized the futility of his actions. At one point, he raised a hand, as if to warn someone, but his movements were constrained by an unseen boundary. He never left his position, never altered the scene. The child, still unmoving across the years, continued to observe in silence, his gaze flickering toward the screen, as though acknowledging that the images reflected not just their present, but an infinite recurrence. There was no surprise in their expressions, only a resigned awareness, a knowledge that the recording was a cycle they could not escape. The final frames made it clear that the film itself had become a participant in the family's existence. The camera had not merely recorded them, it had ensnared them in a loop, one in which their lives and the documentation of their lives were indistinguishable. Every action, every glance, every pause for breath was mirrored on the screen, suggesting an entrapment that transcended physical space and time. It was no longer simply a record of life in 1954, but a trap that bound them indefinitely, ensuring that anyone who encountered the footage would witness not just the Reddicks' lives, but the impossible continuity of their observation, stretching outward in a chain of recognition that could never be broken. The final and most haunting detail emerged in the last moments of the reel, a fragment so brief and distorted that it almost seemed like an accidental exposure of the film rather than an intentional recording. In these frames, the camera was no longer focused on the family performing their routines or on the dimly lit hollow behind the house. Instead, it captured the room itself, the lens angled slightly downward, as if it had been set on a table or shelf and left unattended. The Reddicks appeared once more, seated in the same positions, faces pale and watchful, yet there was a subtle shift. Their eyes flicked toward the camera with an awareness that suggested recognition, a knowledge that the observer was no longer merely an outside party, but part of the same cycle. It became clear that the reel did not end in the conventional sense. There was no closing scene, no fade to black, no natural cessation of movement or sound. Instead, the camera lingered, recording the family as if it were waiting for something or someone. Every gesture, every blink, every minor movement repeated with an eerie consistency, and the moments stretched in a way that defied normal perception of time. The house seemed suspended in a liminal space, a place both real and unreal, where the family existed simultaneously in the past and in a present that no human observer could fully comprehend. There was a feeling, almost tangible, that the camera itself had become a participant, a silent guardian or perhaps a prison, capturing each moment not as it happened, but as it was compelled to exist eternally. Viewers who analyzed the final frames noticed minute details that had escaped earlier scrutiny. Dust motes floated in the air in perfect alignment, the light from the windows remained constant despite the implied passing of hours, and shadows fell in directions inconsistent with any external sun. Even the faint hum of the projector, once thought to be an artifact of age or damage, seemed synchronized with the family's subtle movements, as though the reel itself was alive, responding to their presence and dictating the rhythm of the scene. The implication was undeniable. The camera had not been turned off, nor had the recording stopped. It was merely paused in a perpetual loop, waiting for the next observer to arrive, for the next set of eyes to witness what had been trapped within it decades before. This realization transformed the understanding of the entire film. It was no longer simply a record of a lost family or an anomalous moment in Appalachian history. It was a mechanism, a device designed to extend the family's presence beyond the boundaries of their own lives, to ensnare anyone who dared to look too closely. The final frames suggested that the Reddick story was not confined to a single reel or a single year. Their existence had been captured in such a way that it could persist indefinitely, a silent, waiting truth encoded into the very celluloid of the film, poised to resume the moment it was ever observed again.